Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. There is a familiar proverb attributed to the ancient Greeks that says, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they shall never sit." The implied philosophy being, of course, that when an old man plants a tree that he knows very well he will not live to see grow and bear fruit or enjoy its shade, still he does it so that future generations will benefit from it. It also appears to be, thankfully and blessedly, a guiding philosophy behind the work and principle of one of California's state senators, whose path through the coming of age in a multicultural family and society and in the halls of academia, the fields of business and government, has further refined and defined his approach to addressing public policy issues. Dave Menn is a freshman state senator representing California's 37th Senate District, encompassing Orange County, including the cities of Anaheim Hills, Laguna Beach, Huntington Beach, Newport Beach, and the city of Irvine. He was elected to the state Senate last November and has developed his legislative and public policy portfolio, like his 119 other colleagues, during a time of pandemic and crisis and hardship for his fellow Californians. Before beginning his legislative career this session, Senator Menn was Professor Menn, teaching business law at UC Irvine. He's a native Californian, the son of Korean immigrants, whose memories and time of survival during the Korean War helped frame their family's values and life. There are actually two professors in the Menn household in Irvine. Senator Menn's wife, Jane, is a professor of family law at UCI, and she runs the university's domestic violence clinic and is founder of UCI's initiative to end family violence. On this episode of Then There's California, we'll talk to Senator Menn about his career in public service, his current priorities of working to improve the economic opportunities available to working families, promoting those policies that will help California survive and heal from a deadly pandemic, and also look through Senator Menn's lens as a first-generation Asian American and what it means to be a part of the legislature's Asian American Pacific Islander caucus at the Capitol, and only one of two Asian American senators in the state Senate. Senator Dave Menn, welcome to Then There's California.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian, and I really appreciate the very kind introduction.
Well, glad to have you here, and welcome belatedly to the state Senate. I guess it seems like you were just sworn in not too long ago and given the keys to your Capitol office, and here we are, bada boom, you are already in the last 4 weeks of session, which I guess, to use the college metaphor, kind of like finals month.
That's right. As they say, the days are long and the weeks are short. I think that describes growing up, but also our time in the legislature.
That's right. Well, you're hitting the ground running as a freshman in the middle of a historic pandemic. Not a lot of time to get the traditional get acquainted, take it slow approach for lawmakers that a typical freshman would have. So after the election, as you transitioned from the classroom into the Senate chamber, I know you went through a lot of personal experiences, including the bout with COVID yourself.
So there were a lot of changes, obviously, from being a professor to being a state legislator, and I had to pack up my office. That was something that just had to happen overnight, and I had to find a place to live here in Sacramento. And so all these were things we had to deal with, and it's the logistics of just changing jobs, of having a workplace that is 400 miles or so away from your home. So, that was all very interesting, and we came up in December. My wife and I actually took our kids up in December. We spent our Christmas up here looking for housing, but my very first week in Sacramento for work, the January session, I came down with COVID. I'm sure I caught it on the plane because I had been very careful about not going out in public in December or January otherwise. Right. But I tested positive the Wednesday when we first tested, as senators were required to have 2 tests a week. I was sure it was a false positive. I was like, there's no way I caught COVID. I just have not been exposed to it other than on the plane where I was double masked. But, I had to quarantine. My what was supposed to be a 4-day stay in Sacramento turned into a longer stay. Literally a week after I tested positive, I came down with a rash of symptoms. I had chills. I was vomiting. Shivering uncontrollably, like I just felt like I needed to be hospitalized. So
wow.
I called the Senate staff. They advised that I get an ambulance. So I went down to the hospital. I spent a few days there. And thankfully, thanks in part to the great care I received from the healthcare workers and the nurses at Kaiser here in Sacramento, was just an unpleasant experience for a couple days. Never a fun time being in the ER, but that was all she wrote. And that was, about a 2.5-week stay here in Sacramento. My first experience on the job, but, we got through it.
And surviving that, it could not have helped but influence and frame your perspectives of the legislative process and what you had ahead for you and your colleagues going forward, dealing with legislatively and all the challenges that we're facing in the middle of all of this still here in California.
Yeah, and obviously, so there are two things that I did not really campaign on that became forefront in all of what we were doing here in the legislature. First was the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the different aspects of trying to address this from a policy level. What do we do on the health side? What do we do with the vaccines, which we miraculously developed, and how do we get those shots in people's arms? What do we do around schools and education? The battles and debates over when and how schools might reopen was something that I was dealing with on the Budget Committee on Education, Subcommittee on Education, every week for my first several months here. And the other issue that I was dealing with a lot was Asian hate and the rise of Asian hate, something that, again, I'd not really campaigned on, but being one of 2 Asian Americans in the state Senate, look, if I'm not going to stand up and vocally denounce anti-Asian hate, if I'm not going to try to rally my colleagues and other groups to stand with us, who's going to do it? You have that responsibility whether you like it or not. I am not only representing my district, I'm representing the Asian American population in California, and so that was something I took seriously. Dealing with COVID and all the impacts of COVID, including on our economy, was something that we had to deal with. So it was quite a busy first few months, and I think my staff, which has by and large been here much longer than I have as far as in the building, as they say, they can remark and kind of constantly inform me this is a very unusual session because, as you mentioned at the outset, normally a legislator spends their first couple months here just getting to know the people, the players, having coffee with your colleagues in both the Senate and Assembly, with the different constituent and interest groups that surround the Capitol. But we had to basically work nonstop for those first few months on all these different issues, on the budget issues that were coming up, on all the different aspects of dealing with COVID.
Yeah, you were drinking through a fire hose really through everything, and everything was just defined almost by the week about what was happening with the state, not to mention the pandemic.
Yeah, there really wasn't any leisure time to try to get up to speed. So as a former academic, I like to actually read about what I'm talking about, right, and learn about it. And you didn't really have the time to do that this cycle because, I was dealing with budget issues, complex budget issues. Anyone who knows just a little bit about, say, the K-12 system here in California or the CSUs or UCs knows how complicated those budgets are. And we are dealing with those on a weekly basis, sometimes twice a week, with different aspects of those budgets on the committee I sit on, right from day one. And it was just kind of like triage, trying to learn on the job, trying to understand, basic acronyms and terms and the contours of these different issues.
Well, I want to get into some of those complexities that you have already addressed here. First, I want to reflect a bit on that saying, that Greek proverb that I referenced at the outset, about the old men who plant trees and whose shade they will never sit and whose fruit they will never taste. But that's as it should be. And I saw that on your biography page, actually. And I've heard that before, and I've been impacted by it. But I thought, wow, he's actually mentioned this. And I wanted to bring it up as a way to pivot even to your life story. I mean, if we could, all of us in all walks of life, as workers, as leaders, as parents, live by that philosophy, I mean, what a better world it would be. But that saying's part of the cadence of your life, right? It's part of your DNA.
Yeah, and it's really a big part of why I decided to run for elected office. You mentioned my bio briefly, but my first job out of law school was working at the Securities and Exchange Commission. That was not a prestigious job at the time. I was one of 550 graduates of the class of 2002 from Harvard Law School to join the SEC. I turned down much higher paying jobs, and I did this right in the aftermath of these major accounting scandals at Enron and WorldCom. And for me, I think that was kind of the genesis of this mode of thinking. We have a lot of short-term, self-interested thinking that happens right now. And there's a school of economics that says this is the right approach. This is the way it should be, that people should be selfish. They should be self-interested. They should make decisions only for themselves and only for the short term. And a big critique of capitalism today, and, remember, I went on to go work in economic policy in different capacities, but a big critique of American capitalism today that was not, say, the case in 1970, 1980, 1990, is that we are ultimately short-termist in our outlook. There's like a saying that like the Chinese think in millennia, that like the Indians think in centuries, that the Europeans think in decades, and the Americans think in nanoseconds. And we've really come to encapsulate this mode of if it's not there right now for me, why do it? And I think that has led to the detriment of our society. We've stopped investing in the types of long-term priorities that allow for sustained prosperity and greatness over time. We've been riding on the accomplishments and investments of our predecessors for too long, and we really hollowed out our infrastructure, our middle class, our educational investments, and we're starting to see that and the results of that, I think, right now. And that's why it's so heartening to see so many other leaders really taking up this mantle of investing in the long run. I mean, that's really what this infrastructure investment's about. It's about, Governor Newsom's historic investments in education, in infrastructure, in equity. It's the same mode of thinking, which is it's not necessarily just about the now. It's about what we do to create investments that will benefit us over the long run, our kids and grandkids and beyond.
You have reflected before about the character of America, the character of California, that in some ways it is changing. The default assumption is to say it's changing for the worse, but perhaps to some degree also changing for the better in the wake of what we're going through right now.
Absolutely. Look, and I'm an ultimate optimist, and that's why I ran for this seat. It's why I'm serving. If I was a pessimist, I would go make as much money as I could and try to find a place to shelter down over the next few decades. But I believe we can turn this thing around, and we are facing a lot of challenges. America's facing a lot of challenges. California's facing a lot of challenges. But I think our state, as the most populous state by far in the Union, as the fifth largest economy in the world, and again, by far the largest economy and most prosperous economy in the United States, is uniquely equipped to try to get things done, to try to turn this battleship that we call America around, because we are headed in the wrong direction right now. And we have made a lot of bad decisions. We have disinvested in major areas. But I think our state can lead, and I'm really heartened to see what my colleagues and I are doing here right now to try to really create an alternative to that sort of very cynical economics that defined the 80s and 90s. I think we've got to do it. And again, I'm very optimistic about our future. I'm optimistic that we can fight major challenges like climate change. We can do so in a way that is equitable. And at the heart of this all is, what does America stand for? And for me, I think it's very personal because my parents were immigrants who came to this country. And I think all of us at this point, other than a handful of Native Americans, share that same story in our lineage. Somebody somewhere in our family tree, or somebody's, made that decision to cross an ocean, to cross a border, to come to this country, take a huge risk, go away from their family, the friends, the people and culture they grew up with, because of what America has stood for. And that's this idea that we'll accept people, that we're an inclusive society that offers opportunity to everybody. And I think that idea of the American dream is really starting to fade. Now, we have to restore that. We have to reburnish it. And I think that is the obligation of people right now. It's our generation. And it's on us, the people who are in a position to try to change this thing. We have that responsibility to try to restore what America stands for. And again, it's very heartening to see so many of my colleagues here take that obligation so seriously.
It's great to hear your positivity in what really has been a cultural, economic, otherwise sea of negativity. But you also bring me here to a perfect transition to talk about family heritage, to talk about family tree. You're one of two sons of Korean immigrants who came to California after the Korean War?
So kind of roundabout. My parents first ended up in Rhode Island, and so little known fact, I'm a Red Sox fan, and that's because I was born in New England.
Okay.
And my parents' first experience with Americana was going to Red Sox games at Fenway.
All right. So even though it's said you're a native Californian, in fact, there's a little bit of the...
I was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and came here at I think the age of 2.5 years old. And so, I don't remember anything other than California. So I do consider myself a native Californian, but I was not born in the state.
But your family came here, and there were values and survival, hardship, et cetera, imprinted on them that was taught to you and your brother, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think, my parents grew up during a very unusual time in that they grew up during a war and the aftermath of that war, when Korea was not the Korea we know of today. No K-pop, no Korean, culture, no Samsung, Hyundai. It was truly a third world desolate country where, as my parents described it, was tough to find food. They didn't really have any infrastructure. They had to build that all. So they grew up during that period of intense poverty. And so, I think they're so grateful for everything that America represents, because not only did they come to America and create a good life for themselves here and for their children and grandchildren, but also they grew up uniquely during a time when American GIs and American foreign policy were responsible for them having a positive, good possibility of life. But for the American intervention, they would have grown up in something like Kim Jong-un's North Korea. Mm-hmm. And I probably wouldn't be here. Certainly wouldn't be here in the United States, but I might not be around.
Right.
And so I think in a lot of ways my parents have internalized the idea that America is a force for good. And I think that is one of the reasons I still believe in this idea of American exceptionalism, even as I think it's become fashionable to say, there's nothing special about America. I think there is something special about America, and I think we can restore that something special about America.
So to continue with the proverbial philosophy we've talked about here so far, your family really taught you how to plant trees. You went on to college, to the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School, and then obviously Harvard was in there somewhere. Then it was the world of finance and then government. Is that right?
That's right. And I wouldn't say that was necessarily I think at some point along the way, what I grew up internalizing, this idea that we can do good, that we need to make things better, kind of evinced itself in the different career decisions I made. And there were a number of them, and we all have those choices we make in life. And the choices I made left me a lot poorer than, say, a lot of my classmates and friends in college and law school. But I think ultimately it's been a very positive experience, and I've lived a very interesting life. I've had an interesting career.
You worked for Charles Schumer, for goodness
I did
sakes.
work for Chuck Schumer.
What was that like?
I think I learned a lot, and I would say that Chuck and I didn't always agree on policies, but as I've now sit as an elected official, I have learned so much, and I reflect back on my time with him, and I was only with him for about 2.5 years, but there's so much that I took away that I didn't realize at the time was important. Like, he had an incredible dedication to being back in the state of New York when he was a senator. And being in Washington, D.C. at the time, we always wanted him there. We wanted him focusing on the big policy issues. He was, a fast-rising senator. Why is he spending so much time in the district? Why is he focusing so much on district-level issues? But now that I'm elected, those are the people you're elected to represent. That's at the heart of what your job is. And I see that. It's also important, obviously, for getting elected and for getting reelected. But that dedication to the district and those district-level issues is something I took away. Learned so much about communications from Chuck and sort of how to balance the competing priorities of policy with the political concerns, with the communications and media concerns. And those really there are so many different moving parts being an elected official. And at the time when I worked for Senator Schumer, I was policy staff. I only saw through osmosis some of the other aspects, but it really just was an incredible learning experience from someone who truly is a master of politics at this point. I mean, he obviously now is arguably one of the 2 or 3 most influential Democrats or politicians, period, in the country. And he's done that through just having a savvy, masterful understanding of the different nuances of what it means to be an elected official.
Did the political bug bite you back then? You were told many times in your young life that you would be a great politician someday, even though that really wasn't initially your direction. I think I even read somewhere you were considering being a molecular scientist. So clearly there's been a sea change in your career.
I think my parents and my teachers thought I'd be a good politician because I talked a lot.
Okay, you got the first requirement down.
But
that's okay. That's okay. Someone's blowhard is another person's philosopher.
That's
so
fair
there
enough,
you go.
Yeah. Eloquence vis-a-vis, yes, talkativeness.
Right.
I can tell you honestly, I did not think I would ever run for elected office until after the election of Donald Trump, just because I thought the way to truly influence things was through policy. Policy was the way that we were going to turn this country around. Economic policy in particular, I took a strong bent towards, because I think there a lot of what we're dealing with this in this country today revolves around economic decisions we've made over the last several decades. And I thought that was very important, but I think with the election of Donald Trump, it was eye-opening to me because at some point your frame of reference goes from, hey, we can enact really strong policies that will help us, to maybe we just need to prevent really disastrous policies from ever being considered possible. And that's really politics at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. But we need to win elections, or the difference between good and great policy won't matter, because we'll be staring at truly counterproductive, regressive, and hateful policies, which is what, in my view, we saw under President Trump's term.
Indeed.
It's what, unfortunately, has sparked a movement that we now have to beat back. And so I keep telling people in my district and beyond, every election since 2016 has been the most important election of our lifetimes. Right. And that's going to continue being the case until we firmly reestablish American values at the heart of our political system.
Right. And you, of course, wound up at UC Irvine before you came here. How did you get to UCI, where you actually also met your wife, too?
No, so I met my wife actually in law school.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And then she just happened to also be with you.
We moved to different places. And
okay.
So she was in D.C. with me. She was a professor the whole time. She did things the right way. She did a fellowship after law school, a clerkship, then a fellowship to become a professor, then became a professor. And so after I left the Center for American Progress, I was trying to figure out what I'd do next. And the easy thing to do would be a lobbyist, because, you know, those guys make a lot of money, and what else do you do as a former politico other than go lobby? I didn't necessarily want to take that pathway, and I didn't want to come back home to California. So I threw my hat in the ring to be an academic, and thankfully we were able to get 2 tenure-track jobs at the University of California, Irvine, which was at the time a brand-new institution. Erwin Chemerinsky, who now is the dean at Berkeley Law, had started, and we were excited because it's very difficult to get 2 jobs together as a spousal pair. But we were able to get that, and so we were excited to come back to California in my case, excited to raise a family because I had one child who was just about a year old at the time. We settled down in Irvine, and I like to say, what else is there to do in Irvine other than to have kids?
Right.
So we had 2 more right after that. And,
right. Or teach at UCI.
Well, exactly. And we had the best of all worlds. So.
Right.
But Irvine really is a great place to raise a family. And so, you know, honestly, sitting in 2015 or even 2016, the thought was that we would just kind of raise our family. And we see a lot of our neighbors and colleagues in this situation now and enjoy the many things that Orange County has to offer. And just watch our kids grow up and help mold them into the next generation while hopefully also doing cool things with our academic careers. But obviously that was the path not chosen.
Well, one final question before we pivot to conversations about legislation and what's going on here in Sacramento. Talk about the law students who were in your classes. When we talk about the future, what was their philosophy of life collectively? I mean, did they inspire you as much as you likely inspired them?
I think, you know, what I learned to really appreciate over time was just, you know, and people sometimes criticize this, and I've seen the criticisms of, oh, this generation likes to complain, this is a cancel culture. And I think I saw the flip side of that, which is they were not afraid to voice their opinions about what was wrong or unjust or inequitable. And I actually really admire that about the younger generation. As a professor, it initially threw me for a loop because this is not something I had ever experienced as a student. You know, I'd always gotten used to the grumpy professors who would, you know, if you ever saw like those law school movies, who would take pleasure in embarrassing you.
I remember the paper chase.
Exactly,
yes.
Or 1L, or there's a whole host of those. Legally Blonde, I think, is a more recent example. But again, it's admirable, and I don't mean to describe the generation homogenously. There's a lot of diversity within young people, but a lot of the young people that I taught, and I think culturally this is probably true of the university law school level young folks, they were not afraid to say this is wrong. They're not afraid to call out authority figures. And I think that led directly to things like the Me Too movement and some of these direct challenges to authority figures. And I think that's all for the good, because at the end of the day, if the authority figures are not doing right, it is your duty to challenge them. And I think that our younger generation really has that figured out. And they figured it out while growing up during a series of challenges that people of our generation never had to face. They grew up during multiple terrible job markets. They grew up taking on enormous amounts of debt. They grew up through 9/11, the aftermath of that, and now through the COVID pandemic and beyond. So I think anyone under the age of 30 has faced an enormity of challenges. They've gotten through that, and they've learned that they have to stand up for themselves. They have to challenge folks who are doing wrong, and that's something I really admire, and it's made me more impassioned and less afraid to call out what's wrong when I see it.
Well, let's talk about the passion and calling things out here in Sacramento, your legislative and public policy priorities as you plant some more trees here, but I guess also the process is including trying to pull some of the dead, rotten roots from the same ground that you're planting in. And I know as a member, as you've already mentioned, of the AAPI caucus, you are legislating and living in and raising your children in a state and a country that has seen a significant and traumatic rise in violence and racial violence directed at Asian Americans. It's pegged to have started at the beginning of COVID and the pandemic, with China being considered the epicenter of the virus. But if you look at California, the U.S. history, that's nothing new. So whether it's on the streets with attacks on Asian residents who are leaving their homes or going to the store, or attacks in the local council chambers on elected leaders, even right in the cities in your district, it's happening. It's awful. But how are you as a leader, as a member of this community, reacting to this, actively pushing back against it, and trying to protect your constituents?
You know, you raise a great point. The history of discrimination and racism against Asian Americans is as long as the history of Asian Americans. It goes back to the very first immigrants from Asia. And, you know, in addition to the things you mentioned, you know, there were, of course, miscegenation laws preventing Asian men and women from marrying other races, from owning property, from voting, serving on juries, and other things like that. I think it's correct to say that Asian Americans are the only populace or demographic that have a law specifically barring them from immigrating to this country with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it really wasn't until 1968 that the racial quotas that prevented Asian Americans from coming to this country were lifted. The reason you see a lot of Asian Americans were post-1968 is because of that. Like, my parents came in 1971. I didn't know the reason for that really until I was in my 20s. And so there is a long history. But I will say this feels different. And in talking with other Asian Americans, I think this feels different to them, too, because it is not just hidden or unstated discrimination. You know, we've all faced that. And when we're young, we face insults, and we probably all were called different racist insults when we were younger. But the idea that someone would come up in your space and angrily, you know, maybe spit on you or call you a racist slur or whisper something, but kind of would violate all social norms, and whether they actually physically assaulted you or not, act in a way that felt assaultive, that felt violative of your space and your autonomy. I think that's something that a lot of folks didn't think could happen in this country, certainly not in 2021, certainly not in California and places like the Bay Area or Orange County, and yet that's what we're seeing in the state, in our communities, and of course across the country. And I think that's what feels new about this epidemic of anti-Asian hate. And my belief, and you know, in talking with some academics who actually study this more closely than I think they tend to agree with this viewpoint. Our short-term priority has to be to make it unacceptable again to engage openly in anti-Asian hate. Because right now I think a lot of folks feel licensed to do that. They feel like it's socially acceptable, that it's a majoritarian norm to be racist against Asian Americans in whatever form that takes. And whether you're black, brown, white, whatever, I think that message has gotten through to a lot of the community. Anti-Asian hate is acceptable right now, for whatever reason you think. And so we have to push back on that. And so that's been the forefront of what I've tried to message when I get out there is we have to stand up and denounce this at every possible turn. We have to say this is unacceptable. We need our allies to stand up and say this is unacceptable. When you see something, you need to say something in a safe way, of course, and denounce that, because what we need is people to feel ashamed and embarrassed so that they take that, whatever racist sentiments they have against Asian Americans, and they bottle them up. Now, in the long run, we have a bigger task ahead of us, which is how do we educate and prevent that anti-Asian racism, whether it's, you know, manifest or implicit, from existing in the first place. And that's going to take a lot of education, it's going to take a lot of dialogue, and it's going to take some soul-searching within the Asian American community. We have to ask ourselves, are we doing what we can to stand with other people? And I know that there's a lot of Asian Americans who've soul-searched and said, did I stand up when I saw the African American suffer racism?
Well, what is that quote, when they first came for this particular group and I did not speak out because I was not one of them, and then finally they came for me and no one was there to speak out for me because no one was left?
Exactly, yeah. And so I think that's a really important part of the message that we have to internalize as well as Asian Americans. And, you know, I'm proud of the fact that our office, that our community has stood up against anti-black hate, anti-LGBT hate, anti-Muslim hate, anti-Latino hate, anti-Semitism, and we've seen a lot of those episodes in Orange County, and the community has stood up. And most recently, a number of us stood up because of the treatment of a new Huntington Beach City Council member who's African-American, who was greeted with thinly veiled racist sentiments. And so we have to stand, that's the short term. We have to make it unacceptable again to engage in racism of any kind, but right now against Asian Americans. It's not something I thought I'd spend so much time on, but at this point I've done well over 100 different types of presentations or events or actions because it's important. It's arguably one of the most important issues in my district because whether you're Asian or not, this is not something that we should allow in our society.
Absolutely. And, I mean, you bring up just a valid point, that the continued vigilance and the continued concern that the collective society has to have supporting each other.
That's right, because those who will levy in that anti-Asian hate are the same people that traffic in all sorts of other hate.
Well, not too unrelated to this topic, sadly, is the epidemic of gun violence in this state and in this country. Last year, if I read the statistics right, 41,000 people, a record in modern American history, died in shootings. It's not stopping. California does have some of the strictest gun control laws in the country, albeit a complicated history in enacting and enforcing those laws, which are threatened judicially even as we speak. But as a state, we're not immune to the gun violence historically, even as recently as the MTA shooting in San Jose and the shootings right in your own community in the city of Orange right at the end of March of this year that resulted in the deaths of adults and a child. A child. Now, I know that this incident affected you deeply as a father and as a representative of your community, and I know you are focused on these issues. What's your reaction as we move forward and address again this continued epidemic?
You know, America is unique in that we have uniquely permissive gun laws that date back to the Second Amendment. We also have a uniquely high rate of gun violence in the world, and the highest by far of any civilized country. So the question is, what do we do about this going forward, particularly with a Second Amendment that exists, that is not going to get overturned anytime soon, and a Supreme Court and federal judiciary that are very, very, in my view, extremist in their interpretation of the Second Amendment. And I think there's an example we can follow, which is Ralph Nader and the automobile safety movement of the 60s and 70s.
Unsafe at any speed.
Yeah, that's right. And so, you know, back in the day, there's a lot of similarities between that dynamic and the dynamic today with gun violence. There were too many car accidents. They were killing people. You had an industry that was very powerful, that was very heavily invested in opposing any kind of change. And yet, through more research, through building different types of political and populist alliances, Nader and a number of other activists were able to really make a sea change in automobile safety. Things like drunk driving, anti-drunk driving laws, things like seatbelts and airbags. They were fought incredibly by the automobile industry, and yet today we think of them as pretty commonplace. A lot of the same arguments were there, by the way. This is freedom, it's safety, it's the people's choice. You know, why are you trying to micro-regulate? And so we hear a lot of the same arguments, and I think we have to take that same approach, which is, first, what does the data tell us? What are the right approaches to reducing gun violence? And I think that's going to have to come from more funded research, and some of that is going to have to be state and federal funded. So I very much am going to be supportive of those types of initiatives going forward. How do we find more data on what reduces gun violence? And then we have to really start implementing this in different ways. And we have to do it again knowing we have a hostile judiciary. I just authored a bill this year, as you probably know, SB 264, which would end the state gun fairs. Any gun show on state property, which would apply to most fairgrounds in this.
Right, including the one in Orange County, the fairgrounds in your district.
That's right. They would no longer be permissible if this law is passed, and I think it's on track to get passed at this point, and so we're very optimistic about that. First, those gun shows do lead to a lot of sales of a sort of like a flea market type environment where you have a lot of private transactions that lead to invariably unlicensed or unregistered transactions in guns. They're a prime place for the sale of ghost guns, which are very much a growing problem in law enforcement. But my point is that even if you got rid of all those problematic gun sales, we still should have this law because the state should not be complicit in the distribution of more guns in our communities. At this point, the research we do have is very, very clear that, as you'd expect, if you have more guns in any given household or community or state or country, you're more likely to have more gun violence. And sometimes that's an accident. Sometimes it's a suicide. Sometimes that's two people getting drunk and in a fight and one of them pulls out a gun. Sometimes that's domestic violence. Sometimes that's a crime. But we know that there's indisputable evidence that more guns means more gun violence. And while the Second Amendment protects the right of those to bear arms, it does not require any state to try to profit off these, to be complicit in having more guns be put into our community. So we got to get the state of California out of the business of selling guns. And I think this bill does that, and I'm very proud of the fact that it's there. I think we're going to get it passed with a huge majority, and I think it's time for California to make that very, very important symbolic gesture saying we are not going to be complicit.
When we have a federal judge that compares owning an assault weapon to a pocket knife, we clearly have a change that's needed in the way we perceive violence and its effect on our communities.
That's right, and we have to do this just through a sustained effort. And one thing I will say is that I think that the gun violence prevention groups are getting critical mass, whether it's Moms Demand Action, Giffords, Brady Campaign, Everytown, or so many others. They're out there and they're getting traction because people are getting fed up with gun violence. And I'll just point to a statistic. Last year, we saw the most sale of guns by far in the history of the United States. And anyone who studied gun violence said, okay, this is going to lead to more gun violence. And of course, the NRA and its allies said, no, this will lead to safer communities because the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, which is utter nonsense. And what are we actually seeing this year as we emerge from COVID? We are seeing massively increased gun violence of all kinds. And it's becoming an epidemic. It's becoming something that I think is alarming to everybody out there because it's so random. We're seeing this in San Diego, San Francisco, and the rural communities in Orange County. So I think we're going to continue to see a growing movement to address gun violence. And I think the NRA is on its last legs. I'm very confident that we're going to assemble the coalitions we need to start to get major changes passed.
Well, from your lips to the law's ears here. There is a path, sadly, that leads from the topic of gun violence to another societal epidemic that you are trying to address in your legislative portfolio, and that is domestic violence, yet another societal trauma that was heightened during the pandemic. You have credited your wife, Jane, who, as we've mentioned, has headed up the UC Irvine School of Law's Domestic Violence Clinic, with providing a lot of research and impetus and stories from survivors that have helped drive home some of the necessary needs to help curb this domestic violence problem, and you're putting that into legislation too, including a bill signed by the governor just in the last month or so. Talk about your legislation and your policies.
That's right. So I think two of the first bills we introduced were related to domestic violence, and the one that the governor just signed makes California the first state in the nation to recognize reproductive coercion as a form of domestic violence. Now, a lot of people don't understand domestic violence. We think of domestic violence as a man hitting a woman, engaging in actual assault. And certainly that is domestic violence, but DV goes so much further than that. And that's something I learned from my wife, because when you're in the context of a relationship with an intimate partner, it's not just the actual abuse, it's the threat of abuse often that leads to a cycle of control. And what ends up happening is that the survivor, the person that is abused, is typically controlled in very coercive ways. And so I want to give credit to my co-author on this bill, SB 374, Susan Rubio, because last year, 2 years ago, she passed a bill that made California one of the first states in the nation to recognize coercive control as a form of domestic violence. And this is something that anybody who's worked in the area of DV will tell you is an important element. It's not just the actual violence, it's the threat of violence that can force your victim to do things they don't want to do. And when we talk about reproductive coercion, this is unfortunately too often present part of domestic violence. It's when a partner, typically a man, controls a woman and says, you're going to have a pregnancy, you're going to have my child, whether you like it or not. Or you're going to have an abortion, whether you like it or not, or anything else that effectively takes away their reproductive autonomy. And our bill, I think, by giving survivors of reproductive coercion, those who've experienced this, the ability to access the types of judicial and non-judicial relief that domestic violence laws offer, restraining orders, protective custody, other forms of relief, gun violence restraining orders, it will save lives. Because right now, judges typically don't recognize reproductive coercion as a form of domestic violence. And so if you're suffering from this and you can't prove that you had an actual assault on you recently, because maybe you don't have the bruises, you didn't call the police officer or whatever, you're not going to be able to get any kind of help. So this bill empowers women who have experienced reproductive coercion to get the help they need, hopefully to get out of that relationship and save their lives. The other bill that we proposed last year that we are going to put up next year as a part of a 2-year bill, and it had some wrinkles we need to work out, would allow for people who suffered from coercive debt, that is to say when a partner forces you to take on debt that you didn't want, or actually takes it out in your name, that debt, if you could prove it was the result of coercion by a domestic violent partner, you could have that canceled and attributed to your partner, and you could have that not reported to the Credit Reporting Bureau. And again, this will save so many lives because one of the major obstacles to people leaving these types of violent relationships is the fact that they don't have any money, they don't have any access to credit, they don't know what they're going to do. And if they have kids, that's even worse. How do you get out of that relationship if you don't have any funds? This bill will try to alleviate some of those concerns. We think it will empower a lot of people to get out of domestic violent relationships and save lives.
As we look at these challenges in our society that COVID has only exacerbated but have been part of our lives, another is cybersecurity and our rights to privacy, or lack of, in the digital world. You've been part of the creation of and are now the chair of this new Senate Select Committee on Cybersecurity and Identity Theft Prevention. Talk about what this committee's charge is and the fact that this comes from a personal experience of your own.
Sure. So, as some of the listeners of this podcast may have heard, the University of California was subject to one of the biggest data breaches, I think, perhaps in the United States in recent years. But basically, as I understand it, all employees, all students, many former employees and students and their families were part of this data breach. It was an Accellion file transfer problem, but essentially all of that information went to hackers. And so right now I get these alerts. My information, my social security number, date of birth, and other information is on the dark web. So are my kids, so is my wife.
Oh, my gosh.
And so we're going to have to deal with this
That's
for the
frightening.
rest of our lives, right? And so we can put a freeze on our credit reporting bureaus, but that's really the only option we have. So I think what we want to do is use this select committee to try to help understand the problem. What can we do better? What can the government do? What can the state legislature do to try to create best practices on cybersecurity, both in the public sector and private sector? And you may have seen that Cal Matters story a few weeks ago about how small school districts are actually one of the most common targets of these hackers.
Yes.
Because they don't know how to deal with this. They have typically bad cybersecurity. And when their kids' information is the hackers are threatening to expose all this information on the web, dark web, they feel like they have to pay up. So we're trying to deal with these types of situations. What's the best practice? What's the best practices around ransomware? But I also think there's an important question here about what the state can do on identity theft. To me, it's ludicrous at this point that we're using a 9-digit number that was never intended to be the single identifier for all of us for credit purposes, our social security number. That's what we use for all credit. Why do we have that instead of something else? Why can't it be changed if someone gets access to it? Why can't I add a 4-digit password to it? Why don't the credit reporting bureaus or the banks use 2-factor or 3-factor authentication when someone, maybe myself, is trying to open an account in my name? These are the types of questions we think we'll hopefully get some good answers to. We're hoping that this will tee up good legislative ideas and, again, help position California to be in the lead on a really important issue. When I was breached, when my data was posted on the dark web, this was eye-opening to me, and the aha light bulb went off because I realized I think that all of us, or most of us, will be subject to some kind of cybersecurity breach in the next decade or so. These hackers are way too sophisticated. They have no compunction about hacking even the largest, most sophisticated companies or government institutions at this point. So I think it's only a matter of time. So we really have to start being proactive about how we combat this.
As we wrap, just a final thought perspective before I let you go. The figures of the U.S. Census have come out showing for the first time in history here in the United States and in California, white people are not the majority. As a middle-aged white guy, I don't see that as a threat. I see it as room for hope. And when we use the philosophy about the planting of the trees, that we won't have the benefit of bearing the fruit or sitting in the shade, there's a new generation of people here in California who can plant some different trees and share some riper fruit for the future. Reflect on that as we close here.
Well, to take your analogy, which I guess comes from my saying, which is actually the Greeks, I think what we're seeing right now is, this is just a fact of life. I don't think it's a good thing or a bad thing that middle-aged white guys like yourself are being displaced as the majority. It just is the way things have developed. But there can be a lot of good that comes out of this if we think of this the right way. It's great to have a bunch of maple trees, right? But what's even better is to have apple trees and orange trees and lime trees and papaya trees or whatever else, and then you have a bounteous diversity of foliage, right? And that's ultimately what California is becoming. And you should come visit my home district in Orange County.
Yes.
Because you'll see an example of that. We have some of the most amazing food and culture that you can imagine, because that's what happens when you have different cultural backgrounds coming together. I mean, as much as I love turkey and mashed potatoes, if I had to eat that all the time, I think I'd go crazy. You don't have that to worry about that anymore. You know, I can have burritos, I can have sushi, I can have Indian food. This is an amazing situation that California finds ourselves in. And by the way, it is also so pivotal for our economic growth. It's no accident that the areas that are growing the fastest economically in California and in the country are the areas that have the most diversity, that are welcoming diversity. My home city of Irvine, I think, was the only one of California's cities last year in the census that was one of the 10 fastest growing cities in the country. We almost, I think, added on something like a third, 200,000 to 300,000 in population. And those were people primarily a lot of them were immigrants, a lot of them were people of color. And it's no accident that Irvine is the hottest economy in my region, because those people bring different experiences. They bring knowledge bases. And Silicon Valley, Irvine, Los Angeles, this is what we're seeing across the country. So I think if we want to continue being prosperous, we have to embrace that diversity, embrace that value of inclusivity. If we do that, I think California is going to be in a great position to continue to lead the country.
I am grateful for your reminding us that the investment in California's diversity and bounty is destined to be fruitful. So, Senator Dave Menn, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you joining me here on Then There's California. Good luck with the rest of your finals month here in the end of session, and hope we can do this again sometime.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. State Senator Dave Menn from Irvine in Southern California and Orange County. And that wraps up this edition of Then There's California. It's a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and production support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, Gunjan Patel, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Dave Menn of Irvine, a member of the legislature's AAPI caucus and representing California's 37th Senate District in Orange County, I'm Brian Green at the state capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.